Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. I'm here today with one of my best friends, Herb Butterworth, and we are going to be talking about theistic evolution. So last week I did a presentation really asking the question whether theistic evolution was scientific and biblical, and so the conclusion was it's not either. And so before we go forward, though, if you would, please hit the like or subscribe button. Though the channel is not monetized, it certainly helps it. And with that, I will default to you, Herb. You can open up and lead the conversation.
All right. Well, again, the first thing I'd like to say when we're talking about theistic evolution here, and we have Christians who accept evolution as being true, and they work that into their faith. And there, I guess a big accusation that would be made against us who do not accept evolution, and we are Christians, would be that we're the kind of Christian that we clutch on to our Bibles and we stick our heads in the sand, and we're just refusing to acknowledge the reality that's in front of us. And I would have to say that that's really a bunch of nonsense. We're not attacking evolution here in a religious sense. We're just looking at it scientifically and saying it just doesn't add up. And I guess the best way to do it, you want to just define what evolution is, and we can go on from there.
Yeah, why don't you? I mean, obviously the classic, and I think we need to distinguish at this point. We'll just talk about evolution, not theistic evolution per se, but let's just talk about
just evolution.
Just evolution. And when we say that, we're talking about macroevolution. We're not talking about modifications within species that we know happens all the time. But yeah, we'll and in the presentation, I differentiated it by calling atheistic evolution and theistic evolution. So, I don't know, maybe just for our conversation that might keep us on the same track. But let's just talk about evolution. I know that the classic definition for evolution is really natural selection. In other words, natural selection is the driver. Right. Everything changes with natural selection, and if you can't figure out how it works, you just say natural selection did it. But before we jump into that, why don't you give us a good working definition of evolution without God, atheistic evolution, so that we can understand, at least from that perspective, what we're dealing with.
Well, evolution is it's a bottom-up process in which you start from the simplest life form, probably a prokaryotic cell, the simplest form of life that we know. And over time, it adapts to its environment, making it more likely to survive in that environment by selecting mutations that are favorable to survival in that environment. When I'm talking about mutations, I'm talking about things that happen we have gene duplication, and usually you would get a copy of that original gene, but every now and again you have typing errors, I guess you'd call them, and it's a mistake. And most of these mistakes, or mutations, we'll call them mutations, are detrimental to the organism. In other words, it's harmful and does not allow it to, or gives it less of an ability to survive in its given environment. And some of them are neutral, meaning that it doesn't affect it, negatively or positively. And natural selection really does not care about these things, and normally they're just dropped from the population. But they could conceivably spread through the population. And then you have some mutations that are more rare that are favorable and would give the organism a benefit in that environment. It would help them to survive. Now, if that's the case, if it is a favorable mutation, then natural selection would pick up on that and spread it through the population. And eventually everything in that population would have this mutation. The thing about that is it has to give an immediate benefit. If it doesn't, if that one mutation does not give some immediate benefit, it's not going to go anywhere.
Can I just can I interrupt for a second? So
sure, please do.
And that immediate benefit though does not come out right away, correct? I mean that takes time for it to come out.
Well, see, that's one of the issues that we have here. It has to. If it doesn't, you could consider it to be a neutral mutation. In other words, natural selection is not going to select it, but if it's not harmful, it could drift through the population. That's a possibility. It's not likely to. Most likely, it's just going to be dropped, and nothing will happen of it. But to think that you're going to hold on to that mutation and build upon it with another mutation, that's very, very unlikely. And subsequently, I don't know how many mutations you might have to have before you had some conceivable benefit that would allow for greater survivability in that environment, but it's not very likely. Now we can, we'll go back and we'll look at these mutations. As I said, the first one being harmful, it's going to be dropped. The organism that has that mutation and is harmful to it it's not going to be selected on by natural selection, and that will die out. That's eliminated from the population. Now, the beneficial mutations, yes, they're beneficial, but are they adding anything to the genome? And we'd have to say no, because all of the examples that we have of a beneficial mutation would be something like, we can say like a diving bird, say, and it dives down into the water and catches fish. Now, if there's a mutation in that population that would shorten its wings, it might make it less able to fly, but its diving ability increases and it can catch fish. So we'll look at that as a beneficial mutation. But is it really doing anything as far as the genome is concerned? Is it adding any information? No, in fact, it's taking information away. So the point is that when we talk about beneficial mutations, we're not talking about adding to the genome. But we look at that and we say, okay, we see these, as you described earlier, adaptation or microevolution, as it's sometimes called. And we see that and we say, well, isn't that something? And we go back to Darwin, and he observed these things. And he said, wow, he sees changes fairly quickly in a population. And he used the finch beaks, of course. But if we can see that, and we know that this is happening, and they're adapting to their environment in a relatively short period of time, can you imagine if you gave these mutations millions of years, what could happen? Well, certainly you could conceive of one species crossing over and becoming another species, not necessarily meaning that that first original species is dying out, but you could have a segment of that population that's entered into a new environment. And over time, it's mutating to adapt to that environment. And long enough time, you have a completely new animal.
So you're extrapolating to immensity is really what you're doing.
You're extrapolating to immensity. And this process from the original simple cell over so many years would explain why we have so much variety and speciation in the world. And at that time, when was it, 1859, I think, that Origin of Species was released. Darwin had a pretty good observation there. And that was something you could look at that time and say, wow, he really may be onto something. That would explain a lot of what we see. And they didn't have the knowledge that we have today. It is often pointed out, Darwin didn't think much about a cell. He just thought it was a little piece of jelly or whatever. They didn't understand what they were dealing with there. So we fast forward to 2024 with the technology and the knowledge that we have now, and we look back at a simple cell and we think about something like that happening, and the lack of mutations that we, or positive, beneficial mutations that would add something to the genome. We just don't see it. And it's just too much. It's too much to fathom that something like this could happen over so much time. Again, we see adaptation, and we know that evolution is true in that sense. But macroevolution, one species becoming another, there is no evidence for that. The only evidence that they have that they would make these claims on is the fact that we have such diversity. And the problem is, this is always the problem with evolution. It becomes more religious because of the fact that if it doesn't work, if evolution is shown to be false, what are the implications of that? What's the alternative? And that's why we see such anger amongst evolutionists when people come against it. That's why you can't even have a rational scientific discussion with these people. They get, as you well know, they get furious if you question them. You're attacking their religion. You're attacking their God, and it's horrible. You would think that in a classroom situation where they present such a thing, even if they believe it's so, they present such a thing, you think that they would be pleased with people raising questions about it, saying this does not make sense. You would think that scientifically that's wonderful, and that would be welcome, because the scientific method is to come up with a theory and attack it the best you can. Come against it. Come against your own theory. Try to gather information that would prove it false. And if it stands up, that's great. But you come up with information against evolution, man.
Yeah, you lose your job.
You lose your job. Well, literally.
Yeah.
You will lose your job.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ben Stein did that documentary, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, when he talked about intelligent design. And you know, just so that people can understand where we're coming from, we do not see intelligent design as creation. All intelligent design is, and intelligent design opposes evolution because it is saying that when we see the design in biological systems, that just can't happen. In other words, this mindless process with no predictability, no anticipation, no thought, can just kind of cram molecules together over time, and basically, you know, you have a rock in this hand, and then enough time you get a person in the other hand. Well, people don't come from rocks, and they don't come from stars, Lawrence Krauss, and they don't come from you know, grass or a common ancestor to some animal. You know, the Bible teaches that people are made out of the dust of the ground originally, with the first Adam, a real person. And so because we're on the topic of theistic evolution, the Bible is relevant to our conversation, though we are kind of defining atheistic evolution at this point. But we don't understand intelligent design as creation. We know that an intelligent designer is required in order for the living systems to analyze them and everything else. You would have to come to that conclusion. There's no way to avoid it. However, that is not creation. That will obviously lead to some aspect of creation, but intelligent design, I mean, within the intelligent design community, there's people that, you know, they believe in some intelligence, but they're not even sure what to call it. So, like David Berlinski, you know, we talked about him earlier, Herb. You know, I mean, he's considers himself agnostic. He's certainly not a Christian, and does not, you know, subscribe to the Genesis 1 creation account. However, you know, he's written against Darwin and Darwinism because it's bankrupt. Evolution does not provide a means of what we have today. I mean, it's just that simple. So I just want to differentiate creation and intelligent design. Intelligent design is just basically you look at living systems and you realize, wait a minute, this had to be designed, and you can't have a design without intelligence, which is also why Richard Dawkins says that there's no design, there's no purpose, there's just pitiless indifference in his book. But and Francis Crick, before he died, the co-discoverer of DNA, said, you have to keep reminding yourself that things are not designed. So basically, I have to abandon my own reason, my own senses, and apparently have Francis Crick, or at least his writings, around all the time to remind me what it actually is. It's not what I'm seeing, not what I'm understanding. So those two things need to be differentiated, and I think also as we move forward in this, Herb, we need to differentiate as we talk about the philosophical and scientific aspects of what we're dealing with. For example, intelligent design has been pushed aside as a non-science because they accuse it of being just something that is philosophical and all that. However, it doesn't matter what scientists we're dealing with. When we're talking about science, there is a philosophical aspect to it, and then there's an actual experimental cause and effect relationship that has to be tested out, and that's what happens in the lab. So, I mean, you don't just kind of randomly pick some chemicals, chuck them together, and see what happens. You can blow up the lab. So, what you have to do is you have to take from what you know philosophically and start to reason through the process of why you would even do the experiment in the first place. All scientists have to do that. And even that whole reasoning process, the conscience and everything, is beyond nature, material nature. It's an aspect of us that is non-material. So we're using reason, logic. These are non-material aspects of our being. We're thinking about them, trying to reason through. Then we go into the lab and say, okay, how is this actually going to work? So we need to differentiate kind of philosophical science and experimental science. And it's the same thing in intelligent design. We had actually talked about that earlier, Herb, because in intelligent design, they are doing the philosophical aspect. They're looking at something and saying, well, this is the effect. What can be the only cause? Well, the cause requires some measure of intelligence because it's too much of a complex system. And then you had mentioned one of the things that intelligent design was criticized about in, why don't you get into that?
Oh, you're talking about how they, it's not a real science because they don't make predictions.
Yes.
And a real science makes predictions. And actually, within the last couple of years, intelligent design did make a prediction. And they pointed out, they looked at what was commonly referred to as junk DNA. Now, mainstream science, they would have looked at that and they said, well, these are remnants of evolution. They're parts, regions of the DNA that aren't used anymore. They're just junk. Well, intelligent design scientists looked at that and they said, well, if evolution isn't true and intelligent design has validity, that means that this junk DNA should not be remnants or vestigial DNA. It should have some purpose. So they started looking into it and they did some experimentation and they have found that junk DNA is not junk DNA. They refer to it as interstitial DNA, and it actually has purpose. I think it's very involved in protein synthesis and maybe some other things too. I'd have to read into that again. But the point is that they made a prediction, and their prediction was validified. And it's I think that the problem that they have with intelligent design is where it points. That it's not pointing to the God of the Bible, the Christian God. It's pointing to some deity, that there must have been an intelligence behind it, rather than bottom up like Darwinian evolution is. It's suggesting top down, and that just can't be. As far as the Darwinian evolution is concerned, they won't have it. They just won't have it.
Yeah, that would certainly mean that man wasn't the highest order in existence. It would remove the humanism, wouldn't it? Secular humanism. So, and so that's important to differentiate, because as we talk about all this, and even, hey, listen, even in Darwinian science, I mean, you have to have be able to look at things, and like Darwin did, and he saw the different finch beak sizes, and he made a prediction that I think he was certainly overreaching, that, well, if you can have modification within a species, you can have modification outside of a species to the next, and I mean, I was criticized in the presentation because I had said that dinosaurs were not birds, and the point is that dinosaurs, or giant lizards, or whatever you want to call them, which is what dinosaur means, right? Terrible lizard, but they the whole different structure of a bird and a lizard are different, right? Guy was taking me to task about the differentiation that I was making, and he was stuck on the dinosaurs are birds, and but be that as it may, the point is that there is no evidence that one thing turns into another, and the belief that lizards eventually will turn into birds, and grow wings and all that, the evidence isn't there. And though it is interesting, you talk about design. I watched this thing on falcons, and falcons can spot their prey. I forget the height that they could be at. It was tremendous. They can spot their prey. They dive down, and I think is it the F-16 or the F-18 where the wings actually retract when they go faster. You were in the Air Force.
Well, I know the F-111 did. You could fold the wings.
Well, and I know that some of the modern fighters do that now. As they go faster, they somehow fold the wings back. But they were talking about how they modeled that after watching falcons, because as falcons would dive down to get their prey, their wings would kind of collapse in, and but yet at the same time they also have a glaze on their eyes so that they can keep their eyes open with that speed. And yet, like if we did that, we'd be blinking, and our eyes would dry out in 2 seconds, wouldn't be able to see. Well, they can keep their eyes on their prey, and the lubrication is thick enough that it doesn't dry out, and they can watch it. The only time they lose sight of it is the last kind of few inches where they have to actually turn so they don't hit the ground, and they grab it with their talons. But
well, it sounds like you're describing a top-down intelligent design to me.
Well, that's the whole point. In other words, how do you have that system? Did he not eat for millions of years until his eyes wouldn't dry out? But it has to be in the DNA to have that capability in the first place.
Yeah. And how do you add that information into the DNA in a step-by-step process where one mutation is favored upon by natural selection, and then another one added on to that? The first mutation has to be beneficial. It has to increase the survival rate of that organism to make it dominant, that it can be built upon, so that all these birds would have the same thing, which is
And
what we see today.
and with that first beneficial mutation, assuming that there was one there, each one would have to build upon that particular beneficial mutation, correct?
Correct. You can't just have, Michael Behe, irreducible complexity. And what that's all about is that we have systems in animals that are so complex and so intertwined that to take one part away means it's not working, which would make it absolutely useless. Just in general, we can look at the circulatory system in a human being. We look at, it has the heart, it has arteries, veins, capillaries, etc., and blood. What good are all of the arteries and veins, and what good is the blood if you don't have a heart to pump it?
Yeah.
Why would that evolve?
I just talked about that. Funny you said that in class earlier today with the kids, and because I said, what can you remove? If you remove the heart, you got no life. You remove the blood, you got no life. You remove the lungs, you got no life. In other words, it either works as a system or you're dead. There's no way to build it up.
Right. Now, I read Darwin's Black Box, and I was quite fascinated by it. And I thought, wow, he's got some real points there. And so, as I always do, I read that, and I thought, wow, he's got some real serious points here. How can all of this work? So you try to look at those people that refute it, and I saw a lot of criticism on Behe, but the truth of the matter is most of it was just, it really didn't say anything. It was just saying, Michael Behe's stupid. He just doesn't get it. He's a man who doesn't understand evolution. But nothing really nothing of any substance that could refute what he was saying. The same old things that you hear all the time, I'm sure. You talk to people, you say, no, I don't accept evolution. Well, you're just stupid. They can't articulate why are you stupid? Why should you accept this? What information do you have that you can share with me to make me understand evolution?
Well,
not there.
So along with that, one of the things I mentioned in the presentation was punctuated equilibrium, which Gould and Eldritch came up with. And again, I was criticized because I didn't understand that what Gould meant was there was no basically modifications left over in the fossil record, that the fossil record was never going to have a whole bunch of stuff. And even if Darwinian evolution were true, obviously there'd be a lot of things that may not be in the fossil record, but eventually after you find more and more fossils, you would think that you would come up with something. And but I was criticized because I was told that I didn't understand the punctuated equilibrium and what it was actually saying. And what I was trying to say is that my criticism is that Gould's point was that the thing that was not going to be found gave evidence to the fact that species punctuated to the next species and left no remnants behind, essentially. And I said, so the evidence that there's macroevolution is that there is no evidence, basically, in the fossil record of anything being left behind. And so you can't see any of the modification changes over time because they punctuate quickly. Now, again, that's an assumption. Now, I was told, and you read the criticism that macroevolution is so abundantly scientific and clear that obviously you'd have to be an idiot not to believe it. But at the same time, if that was the case, then Gould wouldn't have needed to write his paper, because he was defining why there was no evidence in the fossil record for what Darwin anticipated should be there. And Darwin did anticipate it being there. However, it was never discovered because it just simply doesn't exist, because Darwinism is not possible. I mean, it's not scientifically possible, and it's not logically possible. You can't get, I don't understand why atheists somehow feel that you can get life from non-life, though we know that that's not the case, and that eventually we'll find that nature somehow gave rise to itself, when we know that that's not possible. And yet they're always talking science and evidence, and yet that has nothing to do with evidence. That's kind of wishful thinking, or some aspect of faith without evidence. I mean, it's one or the other. So I guess, to that, I don't know if you want to make any comments on the punctuated equilibrium aspect before we move along, but.
Well, it's my understanding that Darwin, when he came up with his theory, fully expected they would find many transitional forms along the way. They just haven't found them yet, because this was all new stuff. And he thought that we would certainly have them, and quite a bit of them by now. And we're not talking about having a complete line from one species to another and seeing all the changes along the way. We're not talking about that, but we should have enough transitions in there to suggest that this is valid. This is probably what happened, because we can see these animals changing ever so slightly over time, and now we have this, and it's just not there. And then all of a sudden, in the Cambrian period, we see all of these species formed just like out of nowhere, fully formed. And you look back before that and you can't see any lineage to how these things came about. And that's going to be very frustrating. So I think in answer to that, Gould came up with punctuated equilibrium. So, well, we don't see the transition, so it must be this. So now they're saying, well, evolution is not so much as we had once thought. It's not a slow, gradual process of change, but it's punctuated at different time periods. It'll happen very quickly. We have big changes, might have a new species emerge from it, and then we have a long period of stasis, and then maybe some more changes along the way somewhere. But we're not seeing what Darwin expected to see. And the best thing I can come up with, and I know people will criticize this, but I think the punctuated equilibrium was just made out of frustration. It wasn't there. And we were talking about mutations earlier, and you look at that and you say, well, there's no evidence. I'm sure somebody out there is going to say, we have plenty of evidence of mutations adding to the genome. I don't know of any. I've looked. I can't find any. I found some on like bone density and things like that, but to me, that's not a real issue at all. But we look at that, and we don't see that there are any mutations that are adding information to the genome. I'm not talking about beneficial mutations, completely different thing. I'm talking about information added to the genome. We don't see it. So you would say, just on that alone, you say, well, I mean, an honest Darwinist would have to say at that point, I believe evolution is true. I believe in Darwin's theory. I recognize that there are problems with that, and I can't explain them all, and we may never get to where we can fully explain it. But I believe it to be true. I can see them saying that. But that being said, we look back and we say, okay, well, we don't have the information on these mutations working the way that we thought that they would. But certainly we should see a record in the fossils that indicates these changes over time. But we're not seeing that either. And then, okay, well, that's another strike against it. And then we look at things, and we go back to Behe, and we look at some of these systems. We look at the simplest form of life that we know, a very simple cell without a nucleus. And we look at that, and we find, no, Darwin had no way of knowing this. it is so complex. And the more we look, the more we dig, the more complex it gets. And how are we to explain how this simple form of life ever came to be? Now, I read guys, and I've seen them speaking on certain videos and all that, and they say, we may not fully understand how life formed, but we have a very good idea. We're onto it. That's just absolutely absurd. That is not true. They have no idea how it could have. Their explanations just ring hollow. They say a lot of words, but communicate nothing. They don't know. Nobody knows.
Well, it certainly isn't science, right?
It's not science. It's all speculation. It's just a bunch of, the truth is, Scott, this is a fairy tale. It is. Whether you're a Darwinist or not, you have to confess that there are some serious problems with this theory. And to say that it is anything but a theory, and to be like Richard Dawkins and say it's a fact, it's a scientific fact, it's got all the proof that it needs, that's just not so. It just isn't so. And that's why we reject Darwinism. It's not because we have our heads in the sand. It's just not there.
Because it's not scientific.
It's not scientific.
Though it's kind of like, I guess we have the fake news, so we can have fake science too, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure I'll get criticized for that one.
As a side, I just thought of this now. How Christians are criticized often of using God to fill in the gaps, and we're just afraid of accepting science because we don't like the results of accepting evolution for what it is. And they would say, well, there's no need for God because we have evolution that explains all the diversity and all of that. And I'm thinking about the Huxley Memorial debate back in 1986. And Arthur Wilder Smith.
Yep.
Well, he had a famous debate at that time. And it was against Dawkins and John Maynard? John Maynard Smith, maybe?
So Wilder Smith debated Dawkins?
Yeah.
That was unfair. I mean, Dawkins shouldn't have even showed up.
Dawkins after that decided he's not going to debate creationists anymore. But anyway, the point is this. I found this very interesting. Wilder Smith is up there and he's presenting his case. And I can't remember, it was probably protein synthesis. He talked a lot about that, origins of life. And he presented all of that. And so he got done with all of that. And at the end, I think it was Maynard who was teamed up with Dawkins. And he said, it was very interesting. He said about Wilder Smith, his science is impeccable. In other words, there was no flaw in what he was saying. It was absolutely true. And he did a very good job of it. But he believes in a small tribal God. And we believe in something much greater. And to me, that's like, well, okay. So Wilder Smith said things that are true. And you can't really go against with what he was saying, but I don't like the results. I don't like the conclusions that he's bringing us to.
So it can't be accepted.
It can't be accepted. And yet they'll criticize us of not accepting evolution because it messes up our little fantasy about God. We're looking forward to dying and going to that amusement park, spending our days there eating free cotton candy. And they're messing us up with that.
That's what they think, right?
Yeah.
So let's segue from atheistic evolution or Darwinian evolution into theistic evolution. And I guess the question is, why do you think Christians accept atheistic evolution, calling it theistic evolution? If there's no evidence for atheistic evolution, how could there be evidence for theistic evolution? The only way to do that would be to say at points where there's no evidence, well, God did that, and then that creates a God of the gaps fallacy. And then However, the reason that so many Christians adhere to theistic evolution is because they want to appear to be more scientific and in line with mainstream science. Yet, like, theistic evolution is almost more it's almost more bankrupt in a sense than atheistic evolution, because theistic evolution is trying to say that God did what he wanted to at certain points without leaving any evidence. So as opposed to atheistic evolution that says they have the natural selection of the gaps, hey, if you can't understand it, you don't have the answers, you don't know how it's going to happen, well, that's all right. Natural selection did it. That's how it all happened. It just happened with natural selection. Well, now they're saying, oh, well, we don't have evidence for that. Well, that's because God did it, you know? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure put on people in our whole society to accept evolution as it is. I mean, it's overwhelmingly accepted. And the reason for that is because they got creationism out of the schools. And kids are taught at a very young age that this is how it is. And I was there. I was taught evolution in school, in grade
me
school.
Too.
And I figured it was true. And I heard of people at that time, like when I was young and I was in high school even, and I thought evolution must be true, but I did hear of people that didn't accept evolution, and I would have thought of them in the same terms of flat earthers. Of course it's true.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
But I still believe, well, God had a hand in this, but that's how he did it. And he used evolution in that way. And it wasn't until I got older and I started looking into it for myself, and I was like blown away. You just have to open up your mind and read the information and see what it's telling you. And you find out, wow, it was like so eye-opening for me. Like, wow, they really don't have anything here. This isn't the case at all. But I think that there is tremendous pressure to accept evolution as it is. Let me tell you something. If you're a kid in college these days or in graduate school and you want to get into the sciences, you better not come against evolution. They're going to get you out of there.
Yeah.
You don't have a chance. They're going to call you stupid and you have no future. You're not a scientist. Get out. So you better play the game.
Yeah, you'll ruin your career before it starts.
You will ruin your career. You betcha.
But that's because what they say is that if you don't believe in evolution, then you can't understand science and you believe in fairy tales. I think the reality is that they're afraid that if they actually have any kind of honest inquiry into the evidence for evolution, because it will come up short, then, like you say, the implication will then be, well, we need to look at something else, and because you have a deity at the end of the something else, because you can't have something without somebody making it. Things just don't pop into existence that don't exist. So now we're looking at dealing with, if not intelligent design, creation, and that would just, to think about it, Herb, that would entirely undermine everything that's taught in public schools, that's believed in college and university campuses, and in many secular research organizations. That's the party line. So you would be going out and telling people that what they learned and what they've been taught, though in actual, it's interesting, in actual like everyday science, it's interesting, and I don't want to branch off and lose my point. My point would be, everything that they would learn their whole careers would be nonsense, and that's what they would have believed, and that's hard for people to swallow. But like I'll be reading something about maybe nutrition or something, about like survival, like, you watch these survival programs and how you survive out in the wilderness, or what you can eat and what you can't eat and everything. And it's interesting because though it has zero connection with what's actually being taught, they'll say, well, that's because, you know, we were just meat eaters before. Like, you know, we evolved to be able to do this or that and everything. And it's like, what does that have to do with what they're talking about? Like, it's thrown in. It's thrown in to kind of almost support the party line or what the person that's presenting believes, but it's not required for what they're actually instructing. Like, I have a book over here. It's 60 scientists that believe in six-day creation. They're actually they're actual working scientists that work in jobs where they're actually doing science, chemistry, research, and all this other stuff. In other words, the actual science that they do every day, what they do in working for the companies and what they produce and everything else, has nothing to do with evolution. As a matter of fact, evolution never comes up because it's unrelated to science. It's unrelated to anything that they do. Evolution is just a belief of how we got here, but it's not a scientifically valid perspective based in evidence necessary for us to understand or even adhere to do modern day science. Like nobody does evolution in the lab. Like nobody, you know, these scientists in food companies that are working on different foods and figuring out how to put things together and nutrition and all that stuff. It's got nothing to do with if evolution never hit the planet, they'd still do their job because it's unnecessary. However, when you look back at the history of science, the reason that there was so much scientific discovery is because Newton and the others that, you know, that realized that God existed and he created everything knew that they could pursue and discover more because, to use your phrase, it was a top-down system. And because it was a top-down system, these guys on the bottom were going to say, how does it connect on the way up? You know, like, what do we find? And that's why we had scientific discovery. I think today, a lot of the scientific discovery has slowed down. I think evolution and this kind of pressure to maintain the, you know, kind of the fake science party line has actually stifled evolution when they are the ones that actually accuse creationists of stifling when it's the Christians, in a sense, through history that have actually been the real groundbreakers in scientific discovery.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Evolution in doing science today or doing medicine today has no place in that. I mean, you have a physician and he's dealing with a patient that has like an astrocytoma, say. Is he thinking about how the brain evolved over time? Is he thinking about what mutations were selected in order to get to where he is today? No. He's got a brain tumor and we need to get it out of there. That's all he's thinking. And he's saying, well, we're going to use surgery, we're going to use radiation. What are we going to do? Chemotherapy? What? That's what he's thinking about. He's not thinking about evolution. It has no place in any of this. So most of these guys that are in the sciences like that are not thinking about evolution. The question comes up, they just don't say anything. They don't want to be controversial. They'll just say, yeah. And I think there's a surprising amount of scientists, and I'm talking about biologists and microbiologists, people in those fields that secretly deny Darwinism. They can't help but go through this and question it and say, this doesn't make sense. But they're not going to say anything. Hey, they're just like everybody else, you know. They get jobs and they're trying to feed their families and pay the bills, you know, and they don't want to make a lot of waves. So they're just doing what they do and just keeping quiet about it.
So much for free speech.
Well, like I said earlier, there is no room for scientific dialogue when it comes to evolution. And evolution, no matter what evidence you come up with against it, and to me, I think it should just be done away with. But The problem with it is it's going to be around for a long time, because evolution, it supports a godless worldview. And those people in that culture are going to hang on to that, and they're going to defend it to the death. They will not let it go.
I think it's interesting how evolution actually ties to religion, not only its own religion, but I mean, there's so many kind of weird religious beliefs, that think that, we're supposed to really kind of punctuate to the next level. Remember the age of Aquarius, that nonsense when we were growing up, when love will stare the stars and peace will guide the planets, and and then we were supposed to have that. Was it in the 80s when everybody was going to do the hold hands around the world, and then that was supposed to kind of jump us up to the next level or whatever?
Coke, is that what you're talking about?
There was some of that advertisement, I think, in with it. But do you remember that? I mean, they actually thought that they would kind of kick us into the age of Aquarius if everybody was we
all joined hands, we're all living together as one in a perfect utopia.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, because we have to do that. I mean, actually, that's just a precursor for what the Antichrist is going to do. But
Karl Marx and the state will dissolve itself once we've reached that utopia. Yeah. These guys are going to give up their power. Stalin was going to give up his power any day. But,
oh yeah, yeah. And the irony is that isn't it interesting that when you have a totalitarian government, you have no free speech. In other words, you keep the party line, or you go to jail, or you lose your job, or you can't function, and you become just pushed aside in society. And isn't it exactly the same, ironically, within the science field, because it's dominated by atheistic evolution, and if you don't kind of march that line, then same thing happens. You say something.
You are canceled.
Oh yeah, they were canceling before cancel culture was a thing.
And the thing that really disturbs me, and it really does, it's even if evolution were true, and you had people coming against it, you should welcome those criticisms. You should really want to dive in and investigate what these people have to say. What does Michael Behe have to say? Let's listen to him. Let's see what he says. Maybe we can improve our theory a little bit, if you want to call it a theory, or maybe we can listen to him, hear him out. He's an intelligent guy. He's a biologist. He has something to offer. He's educated. And maybe we'll just disregard what he's saying because it just doesn't work out with the truth. But they're not willing to do that. They don't even hear the man.
Well, imagine building a spaceship or an airplane, and then you go to send it to the people that are, the quality assurance group, and they have to now start testing to see if there's any problems with it. You go, whoa, wait a minute. We can't have that. You just put that thing out on the runway.
Yeah.
Like you're not going to, it's like, don't you want to know if there's problems with it? And the problem is they don't want to know if there's any problems with the evolutionary theory and what they believe, because it'll disturb the party line. And again, like you say, it opens the door to an alternative which cannot be allowed. God forbid that we actually start to think and reason things through. But listen, we're coming to the end of the hour, and maybe we should we'll plan to do another discussion where we actually can get into the Bible and talk about like walk through some verses and why theistic evolution actually is incompatible. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Some things that are really fascinating. I know I've talked about this with you a number of times over the years, but one of the things that really fascinates me about the Bible concerning this is why in Genesis does it make such a point of and each kind reproduced after its own kind? Because back then, when Moses was recording this, well, of course they do. Why are you even saying that? But today, you can see, well, he needed to say that.
Well, apparently God knew something, right?
He knew something, yeah.
But
yeah.
But before we end this one, why do you think Christians accept theistic evolution?
I think they accept theistic evolution.
I mean,
because
aside from just being indoctrinated into it and not knowing any different.
I think basically that they're indoctrinated into it, Scott. I think that's the main thing. It's commonplace in society. They're taught that in schools. They grow up with it. Of course, it's true. It must be true. Now that what they would say is what I thought when I was in high school in those years, and they think this is what God used. This is His plan, and this is how He brought us to be. Now, there's a big issue with creation of life. And I think a lot of theistic evolutionists would say, well, He uses evolution, but of course we couldn't get life without Him. He started life, and then evolution kicked in. I think that's what it is. And because most people believe that, and a lot of people have a very negative idea of people that don't believe in evolution, I think that certain churches are afraid to go against it.
Well, I mean, I get the indoctrination thing. Here's what I don't get. At least in my mind, if we discovered DNA and understand the implications of that, at that point, any scientist, you would think, would sit there and say, well, obviously evolution can't be true. It can't work just based on that alone. And I mean, it's like the medical doctor that somehow thinks that, a baby in the womb is not human. I mean, we're dealing with kind of absurdities at this point. But you have some pretty smart Christians that are scientists and other that believe in theistic evolution. Why do you think they do? Because they have the understanding, like the guys at BioLogos and stuff like that.
That I don't really know. I just go back to peer pressure. They don't. I'm kind of hesitant to say this, Scott, but there's a lot of churches out there that are very interested in filling their seats. And I think that they don't want their church to be seen as a crazy church where they don't believe in evolution and accept what is known to be true, to go against science. And I think that there's that pressure there to accept it. I can't think of any other reason why they do that. See, the problem with it is, and we'll talk about theistic evolution some more, and in the Bible, but as you well know, that to accept theistic evolution is to go against what the Bible teaches us, and that could be a little bit of a problem. And that we're not, again, I want to clarify, we are not rejecting evolution based on what the Bible tells us. I guess in part we are, but we're looking at evolution and what does it say scientifically, and is it valid? And we find no, it's not valid. And then we look at the Bible and it says, when the Bible says that evolution is not a real process, and then we say, wait a minute, what's a more reasonable explanation? What is the Bible is telling us this? And yes, there's some miracles in there and supernatural events in there. But is it more reasonable to accept that as an explanation or this nonsense of evolution? And if we accept evolution, which we never should do, then we're going against what the Bible tells us. And if we go against what the Bible tells us in Genesis, why would we accept any of it?
Well, I think that, and again, I don't want to have things confused. Um, so I think that evolution, macroevolution on its own, because it has no real evidence to support it, then we're not really rejecting Darwinism based on the Bible. In other words, choosing the Bible or evolution as though like Darwinian evolution is like an alternative that exists, but we just decide not to go that path. I mean, I think that we're not going that path because there's no scientific evidence for it. Okay, but I want to distinguish that from then moving into when we're talking about theistic evolution, we're just saying, well, theistic evolution is using the same evidence as atheistic evolution, which means they don't have any real evidence for it either. However, if I take the Bible as it's written and what it says, and then I compare that with what we understand and what we've discovered scientifically, then though the Bible isn't getting into DNA and explaining all that process and everything, do we know that things reproduce after their own kind? Absolutely, right? So I see that today. The Bible told me that, in Genesis 1. So I see no incompatibility. So what I'm seeing scientifically and what I know to absolutely be true, and even scientists can't kind of break that the body plan's locked into the species. In other words, scientists can't take a mouse and make him into a bird or something like that. So, and they can't manipulate that. I mean, within each kind of family or species family or whatever, there's limitations. Like you can't make a dog into a cat. Okay, so because of those limitations, I know scientifically that within the dog family, though there's a ton of variation, they're all dogs. Well, what do I find in Genesis 1? Well, they're going to reproduce after their own kind. They're all dogs, right? So the science, the observational science that I can actually do experiments with today and look and understand correlate with what the Bible tells me. It doesn't correlate with one thing changing into another, species or completely different, body or whatever. And because I don't see that today, I have no historical support for that. It's all based on assumption, and the connections are in the minds of the scientists. They're not in the lab. That's the difference, right? The connections. But when I go to the Bible and it tells me that God created the universe, well, the universe had to have a beginning, so that's pretty simple. Obviously, as a Christian, I would say that I believe that the God that created the universe is the biblical God. The only other alternative, would be some other theistic being. But again, you still have to have some historical evidence and some practical evidence over history to get to that God. Like you can't just say, oh, well, it was Muhammad's God. Well, okay, so what do we have for verification for, the Quran and the documentation there? Well, Muhammad said that it was the word of God. Okay. Anything more? Like, is there any way that God, verified it in time? No, he just kind of, that's what Muhammad said. So basically I take Muhammad's word for it or I'm done. Well, at least with the Bible, every time God sent his spokesman, he accompanied them by the miraculous, the power of God. So there was God reaching into time at that historical moment and doing something to validate, and then that's what's recorded for us and everything else. So you have a record that matches with history and the miraculous of the being that's outside of time reaching into time, to do what he does. But you don't have that anyplace else. So when I look at the Bible, as opposed to just saying, well, the Bible says this, I'm going to ignore science and just believe the Bible. I believe the Bible, but then when I look at science, it never contradicts it. It only supports it. It's like archaeology.
That's in my quest to come to an understanding on this, which is still going on. It's a never-ending thing. I would look at things that we observe in the world and the universe. I've always been interested in that kind of stuff. And I look at that and I say, at first, 30 years ago, I'd look at this stuff and I say, well, it's supposed to be science versus religion. And over the years of doing this, I found out that's not the case at all. It's not science versus religion. I read the Bible and I look at what we can observe in the world and throughout the universe, and there is no contradiction, contrary to what many might tell you. You can believe what the Bible says, and you see it verified in what we observe. So science versus religion is just not a thing. That's something that people made up to start a controversy and to attack Christians with. But I think what we'd like to do here is get people to at least admit a deity. I'm talking about, you're familiar with Anthony Flew?
Yep.
And he was a lifetime atheist, and at the end of his life, studying DNA and looking at the complexity of it, probably the kinesin that you're a fan of, and I am
favorite,
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, just looking at that and the complexity of it and the code that's in it. That's a whole other thing. We can go into code and information theory and all of that, but the code and the complexity of it, the machinery that is in there, and looking at that, he said, I can't look at this and deny an intelligence behind it. Well, the theistic community was very upset with him and came down on him for doing that. And he said, hey, I go where the information leads. That was his response.
Now, was that, because I actually, again, I was doing a presentation in class today. I had a couple of slides up from his quote from God. Is it God and the Scientists?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, he said, look, you can't avoid it, And it's interesting because he said, for the scientist that's based his whole career on reasoning, it's now the reasoning that's providing him the information and the conclusion that that God created everything.
Yeah,
that was basically.
So I think that's a big step, and I wish if Anthony Flew was alive today, I would do my best to get in touch with him and say, now, go to Bible Made Clear, pick up on the Paths video.
Yeah.
See, that's the third thing. Get somebody to be a deist, and then they say, well, I don't know, is it Buddha? Who is it? And whatever. And then I would recommend the Paths video, and I think that's a very, very logical step-by-step. Why should we trust the Bible? Why should we know that the Bible is true? And I think that's undeniable information. It was a beautiful video, beautiful presentation that you made. And anybody that's watching this video, if you haven't seen that one, I would go back and take a look at that. It's wonderful for each individual to watch it, to get some things clear in their minds. It's also, if you want to go out and witness to other people, this is a great tool to have in your pocket, and I would very strongly recommend it.
Well, isn't it interesting, though, Herb? Because
you owe me some money for that.
What's that?
You owe me money for that one. That was a plug.
So the interesting thing is that what you just did was you said we want to basically use evidence to get people to the place where they admit a deity.
Right.
And then you can move to Christianity. And like you say, that the paths method is a simple method to do that. Because, again, it provides evidence, right? But if a person came to the place and they said, you know what, I realize there does have to be a God, like some kind of God. But how do I know which one? Well, again, we got to that point with evidence, and we want to get to the end point with evidence too.
Right.
In other words, it's never moving from evidence to non-evidence, right? Because even when you take the step in faith, if I could theoretically, you bring somebody that says, well, I don't know, I don't think God exists, or I don't know, and then you provide some evidence, and then they say, well, I guess, you know what, that the only reasonable conclusion you can come to is that somebody has to exist to have created the universe, right? So it's like, well, how do I know what God that is? Well, then I can provide that paths evidence and talk to them about the God of the Bible, because it's still an evidentiary path to bring them to that point. The only time that faith is exercised is stepping into a relationship with Jesus Christ, but it's based in evidence. In other words, so many people think faith is in contrast to evidence, but faith is using evidence. In other words, my faith in Christ is based in evidence. It's not just based in wishful thinking. If Jesus didn't actually raise from the dead and there's no evidence for that, I need to look for a different job. I got to do something else on, Sundays and during the week, because I'm wasting my time. Like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, people that preach the gospel, like the apostles, he said, we're of all men the most to be pitied, because like here we are, we're sacrificing our lives here to present a message about the resurrection of Christ when people don't raise. Like, it's a waste of time. It's a massive, self-delusion and everything else. And the people that believe it are no better off, because they're believing that their sins are forgiven and that they can go to heaven when none of that exists, So, but my point is that it's always a line of evidence. The evidence never goes away. And even when we take a step in faith to believe in Christ, it's based in evidence. The step is into the relationship with the person of Jesus Christ, but that's still based in evidence. It's not just like faith in the ether. Do you know what I mean? That faith requires an object, and he's the object of our faith. But it's because he's an actual person that did an actual thing, and there's evidence for that, I guess, is my point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's not an irrational thought that you have, like you wish God to be true and you don't have any evidence for it, but it sure sounds good. And I like the idea of that. I like the idea of going to heaven. It's just happy times after that. And that's why we believe what we believe. It's not that. It's not that at all. It's very much based in evidence.
Yeah, who was the philosopher that came up with wish fulfillment? That's what he was. The cobwebs are there. I can't remember his name, but he was an ancient. I think some time ago. It'll come to me after we stop the video, right? But I think we've kind of beaten that today and got the point across, hopefully, and then but I think that we need to conclude with a second video, a part 2, I guess, if you will, where we actually, we'll get the Bible out and we'll talk about some of the texts that are just not possible or compatible with evolution, which means theistic evolution can't be biblical. How's that sound?
It sounds wonderful.
All right. Yep. So listen, we thank you. We apologize. I know we're at about an hour and 14 minutes here, and Longer than we like to run the videos because we know it's a long time to sit there, but we will do a part 2. Herb and I will get together and try to walk through the Bible and give some supporting evidence. So until next time, and again, we appreciate you staying with us if you're still here. May God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.